Hello and welcome everyone. It's Lloyd and I'm back with Odon LaFontaine, with Paul Ellis, and of course JC, Quranic Endgame. We're here to discuss Islam. We're going to look at the Gnostic influences on Islam. We'll also have a look at some of the pre-Islamic influences on Islam, looking at the culture and the practices of the day. And also, we're looking at what influenced Islam. Can we find the sources of some of these practices, beliefs, and look at some of the less well-known, the more obscure aspects of Islam? And hopefully at some point, I know Odon loves to talk about the Aramaic aspect, something we should explore in the future. So we might start touching on that a little bit. And I'm going to introduce one answer. I'm not saying it's the answer. I don't think it's the only answer, but I'm going to introduce what I think is an answer to the Quranic challenge of produce a surah like it, and look at what they could have meant when they said it, and it may not be what you expect. So yeah, guys, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Great. Hi, Lloyd.
Hi, Lloyd.
Hey,
hello, everyone.
Yeah. So what have you guys taken away from what I've been discussing so far, from the series so far? And has it added to your knowledge or given you questions to think about?
For my part, it sort of reinforced my hypothesis that there is a Jewish current that was very influential in the beginning of Islam, and it added something also. It's that some influences happened way after Islam began. They were added at a later stage, and these influences they came from the antiquity. So we have a sort of double feed system into Islam. We have something at the origins of Islam, which is ancient, which comes from, I think, Judaism, and also a whole bunch of other influences, and some other things were injected into Islam centuries after. But these things are also very old and ancient, but they were only injected in Islam around the Abbasid era.
If you think of how early historians talk about Islam as incomplete, very little like what we have today. And then if you think they needed to put together a workable religious social system in a very short time, they would have borrowed and taken pieces that they thought were compatible and built something from what was around them. And that could explain for the inclusion of some of these oddities.
Yeah. This is what Patricia Krohn wrote in our article. What do we know, or what do we actually know about Muhammad? She wrote that most of the hadith that and the tradition that relate to government, taxes, the way you have to treat Christians and Jews, those were questions that made no sense during the time of Muhammad. And so the tradition were invented later, and most of them were copied. For example, the jizya tax, they were copied on the Persian system.
Right.
So they had to have some legal experts, religious experts from the Persian Empire, maybe Jews or Persians or Christians.
Yeah. Anything from you, Paul? And then JC, before I jump into today's talk.
Yeah, just picking up on what Odin said. For me, my interest is the Quran. If I had to define my question that I ask myself and try and answer is, what does the Quran mean? And for that, you have to know a little bit about the context in which it was composed and the process by which it was canonized. And the two are by no means the same thing. Part of it might have been composed and then somebody else came along and edited it and so on. But that's the parameters of my core interest is what happened. What happened after that, somewhat less interesting. There's a secondary issue. It's interesting, and it casts light on the meaning of the Quran. If you can find, if you can retrace the steps and you can find out the process, then it might tell us something about the Quran itself. What I really found interesting in the last talk we had was about John the Baptist and the role of John the Baptist, who is, I think John the Baptist and Zechariah are given a disproportionate amount of attention in the Quran compared with other characters from the life of Jesus, and I find that very interesting. And the fact that John the Baptist was so important in the Elchasites in particular is a theme that really goes down to the heart. There, you're not talking about the later Abbasids. One is really talking about the author of the Quran at the time that he's writing the Quran, and of course John the Baptist so important in Damascus, which rather makes one think in terms of Damascus or in terms of that area, to my mind.
Yeah. I wonder if the question from you can do it too. How late does Paul think parts of the Quran were inserted? I mean, we've discussed on the channel, even with Odon, up to some analyses indicate up to 50 authors over 200 years based on linguistic analysis using algorithms. Your thoughts, Paul?
Well, the question was, my methodology is I tend not to go against the experts. There's very few instances in which I find an academic and I say, I disagree with this person, I think this person is wrong. I disagree with all their conclusions in the totality. I think that the whole of the professional academy has been is far too tied to the traditional narrative. But if I find an analysis of a word or a passage or something of that sort, or somebody says this is what the epigraphic evidence shows, or this is what the manuscript evidence shows, I don't go head to head with that, because I am an amateur and I know my place. I like to stay in my lane. What I'm trying to do is put together all their findings. Whenever an academic looks into an area of the Quran, almost invariably they will find something that is hard to fit with the traditional narrative, and they will report it, and they'll say, yes, more research needs to be done, or we don't really understand how this fits into the picture, and it's all a great mystery. What I want to do is take all the pieces and solve the mystery and find a solution. So, long way round of getting to the point that the conventional wisdom of those people who look into this properly is that the Quran was composed by the mid-7th century in its canonical form, in a complete codex, and so of course the Birmingham manuscript has the headline date of 645, that it couldn't have been compiled, or 95% certainty that it wasn't compiled later, for an animal that died later than 645. So I'm happy to take 645. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that I think that Islam was working from the Quran in 645. From what I've seen, the surahs were circulating individually, and there may well have been surahs out there that never made the canon and might have been in different forms. So there might have been strange forms of the Quran moving around. And one area I wouldn't mind, I could maybe do lead one of these discussions.
That wouldn't be a surprise because if versions of the Quran had to be burned, then clearly there were some, shall we say, faulty versions of it roaming around.
Yeah, and one issue we could have a look at is sometime, I'm not quite prepared for it today, is the Dome of the Rock. And one thing that's interesting is that the mosaic work is far more advanced on the inside than it is on the outside. And the text on the outside is virtually none of it is Quranic. It's all Quranic style language, but none of it is actual quotations. And it's only when you get onto the inside that it starts quoting long passages of the Quran in the more refined mosaic work. The outside mosaic work is rather basic in comparison with the inside. And so my general scenario is that while the Umayyads were in touch with the spirit of the Quran, they didn't actually have the text, or they didn't recognize the text as late as 700.
That's something I can probably work with later on. That's an interesting point. That's a very interesting point. Keep that thought warm. We should talk about that.
Paul, you said you relied on academics. I also do. And the most advanced of them in terms of codicology and studying the ancient manuscript of the Quran is François Desroches here in Paris. And his datation for the oldest manuscripts of the Quran, which is the Sana manuscript, is he thinks it cannot have been written before Abdul Malik due to the writing that is actually used in this manuscript. Some letters were invented during the reign of also some letters, or maybe some marks were invented during Abdul Malik's reign. So the oldest manuscript is from Abdul Malik's reign or after his reign.
Yeah, let's not get too carried away on that. That's kind of way off topic from where I'm going today. So we've really drifted way off into.
Park that for another time. Yes.
Yeah, JC, any thoughts before I jump in?
Well, just briefly to mention that I don't believe in the narrative, of course. I think the whole thing is fabricated and much later. But through this series, what I'm realizing is how many things I did actually take for granted without questioning. And now you're showing, well, we have these problems even into the Sharia. Maybe they borrowed from here, from there. So there are things that I would have oversimplified before and said, well, the book is from the Jews and Christians, and then the traditions is just some Arabs doing what they were doing. But it is a lot more complicated than that. That was an assumption. So yeah, this is opening my eyes to try to think more critically about how the traditions became what they are.
Great. If Allah's a deceiver, he's going to try to direct your attention somewhere where he wants you to go, and he also wants to take your attention away from something he doesn't want you to look at. So that would be standard practice if Islam is doing what Islam does. I want to bring up one thing here. We discussed this yesterday. For instance, the stories of Harut and Marut in the Quran. Now, Usama speaks Arabic. He's been studying Islam and the Quran since he was a child. He had to study Islam and the Quran at school in Egypt. Now, and then so yesterday we discovered that these sources we're doing a series on all of the sources of every single myth and narrative in the Quran. Now, for instance, Harut and Marut, the names of those are two ancient Armenian deities worshipped by Armenians before their conversion to Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries, right? In Armenia, they were termed Horot and Morot. Horot and Morot, Harut and Marut, right? And they were among this assistants of the goddess Spandaramet, right? And they were demigods of Mount Masis or Mount Ararat. And then, of course, the Horot and Morot appear in the Avesta as Harvat and Amaratat, right? Haravat and Amaratat, abundance and immortality, for instance. However, the Armenians got them from the Zoroastrians. They were the chief assistants and ministers of Ahura Mazda, or Mazd, right? Harvatat and Ameratat are inseparable companions, right? And they were also known in later Persian as Hurdar and Murdar, okay? We know them from Walt Disney as Tom and Jerry, right? So, or Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. You'll know them from Warner Brothers. So their proper form in Sanskrit is Sarvata and Amrata, right? The former occurring in the form Sarvatati in the Rig Veda. So, for instance, we can find almost everything that Islam references in a previous source. And then they claim suddenly Harut and Marut are directly the words of Allah, when we can find them almost spelled almost identically in much older pagan sources, right? Any thought on that before I continue?
Well, just point out that the terms wouldn't have to, But it wouldn't be surprising if the terms refer to entities that are already out there, because what would be the point of mentioning some names if they didn't actually refer to anything? If I told you a story and gave you two names, it wouldn't mean anything if you didn't know who the people were and you couldn't trace them. So it wouldn't be entirely surprising that they do refer to that. What I find quite interesting about this, about that passage, that verse, is that they're teaching magic. How is married to teaching magic, and magic is often, I think, associated with Babylonia, and that's why they talk about the angels from Babylon.
Correct, and this is relevant here. Yeah. Any other thoughts before I continue? Okay, I'll jump in. Yeah, Odon, please.
No, nothing to say here. I didn't know that Harut and Marut were from a Persian background.
Yeah, through Armenia. Yeah, crazy
Through Armenia.
stuff. But you can, every single story in the Quran has a source that is outside of the Quran. It's not the word of Allah. It's just borrowed from another culture, pagan or Gnostic or whatever. Yeah, sorry, Odon, I think you're frozen. Do you want to continue? Oh, you're back, Odon. Go on, please.
No, I had no comment at all.
Okay,
no, I was checking the verse in the Quran.
Okay, so one of the last slides I did on this series was we spoke of the word kisa, right? Elchasai, and the name apparently derives from a piece of clothing like a shawl that he wore called the kisa, right? And the people of the Bait, al-Bait, the house, right? Literally the people of the house, right? Which is the family of the prophet. And then also the family of the prophet is also known as the people of the kisa, right? People of the mantle, people of the shawl, people of this cloth, right? And kisa is a word for a garment. In North Africa, a piece of flannel worn by learned men around the body and the head, right? So that's the kisa, al-kisai, right? So technically, for some, the family of the prophet is also known as the people of the al-kisai, which is a really odd thing, right? Now, for instance, we asked Anas ibn Malik, which garment did Allah's messenger, may peace be upon him, love or like to wear? And he said the mantle of Yemen. Right? Interesting. So there's several of these hadiths, not just this one from Muslim, but there's several. Now, there's these odd little things that just pop up and then they just get abandoned. They loose ends. But there's several of these. He loved to wear the mantle of Yemen, his favorite piece of clothing, which would be something like a kisa. Okay, fair and well. So not to say that the Yemenis were Elchasai or that Elchasai were in Yemen, but trade routes were the internet of the day. So let's look at the book of Angelic Secrets of Raziel the Great. Rabbi Yishmael said, Metatron, the great Lord, said to me, I bear this testimony on behalf of the Lord Yahweh. This sounds already like the Shahada, I bear witness, right? Elohim of Israel, the living and enduring Allah, Lord and Master. His height from his seat of glory and up is 10,000 parasangs, right? So we spoke of these massive angels, these large angels, and the Shur Kama, the measurements of the body, right? That the Kabbalistic, the mystical Jews would use to try to measure God's enormous size and the enormous size of the angels, right? So they have all these massive measurements, 23, 10,000, 1,000 parasangs, and so on, right? So God is 150, or the angel Michael or Gabriel is 150 kilometers tall, right? His head touches the sky. We had the same within certain Gnostic streams, but it comes from this Jewish mystical mythology. He's called the Great, the Mighty, the Awesome, and then here we see he writes here, Klatu Barata Nikto. I'm pretty sure. Did I read that correctly? So Klatu, but I can't read this if my life depended on it. This is worse than Polish. Okay. But you can see you've got some really odd writing here. Blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever. Klatu Barata Nikto. Okay, fine and well. So it is said, he who knows this mystery is assured of his portion in the world to come, is assured to be a son or daughter of the world to come, and will be saved from the punishment of Jahannam, right? In, of course, Islam, hell is Jahannam, right? And will be saved from the punishment of Jahannam, hell, and from all kinds of punishments and evil decrees about to befall the world. So these people were very apocalyptic, believing the world would end, which was very much like what Muhammad was like. and will be saved from witchcraft, for he saves us, protects us, redeems us, and rescues me from all evil things, from harsh decrees for his name, right? A long hymn then followed, and the alphabet is repeated several times. And the hymn concludes with the verse, Lord of hosts, happy is the man that trusts in you. And Rabbi Yishmael said, I've seen the King of Kings sitting on a high and exalted throne. His hosts stand before him on his right and on his left with the Lord of the presence. And his name is Metatron. And then they write, Rav something, okay? And you can see these rhyming. Atimvin, Hugrvin, Sigrvin, Sirtvin, Snigrvin, Mukvin, Huskimvin, Stimsum. Right. Something. And Rabbi Yishmael said, what is the measure of the Holy One? Blessed be he who is hidden from all creatures. The soles of his feet fill the world, and the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. So the height of each soul is 3 10,000 of parasangs. The sole of his right foot is called prismia. You can see these are nonsense words. It's a nonsense language in a sense, right? Now, this is mystical Hebrew, and the scrambled text is Hebrew, but it is, and I'm simplifying a heck of a lot. So I'm going to only go through a few slides, but I'm heavily simplifying a lot of this. It is a very specific mystical form found in what's called Hekkalot literature, Jewish palace mysticism, dating from the 2nd to the 7th centuries. So the text describes a visionary journey to see the throne of God. This is what Sufis do when they go into their trances and they go into do these rituals where they repeat certain mantras, right? One finds passages such as this in the Hekkalot Rabati or similar ascension texts. This is where you let go of your logical, rational self. You go into what they call pre-conscious or post-conscious states. You free yourself from the body, from the mind, from reason, from logic, which is a trap, like what the mystics believe, that we are trapped in this world, and they rise into this other dimension, the spiritual dimension, and they can enter into the throne room and basically commune with Allah. While the introductory sentence is in standard Hebrew, the list of names serves a different purpose. The strings of capitalized letters like Piskanvni or Zint, whatever, are theophoric names or words of power. Written using the Hebrew alphabet, they are not standard vocabulary words you'd find in a dictionary. Many are scrambled or encoded versions of the divine name Yahweh. These are also angelological. These are secret names of the angel Metatron, or the gatekeepers of the heavenly palaces. These are also liturgical sounds. In Hekkalot practice, these were often intended to be chanted as incantations. So they had no meaning. They had no actual dictionary meaning. They were phrases you would say to eventually numb your senses, and so you could detach from reality and float into the ether, right? And it allowed the mystic to pass safely through the celestial gates. It is the equivalent of a spiritual password used by ancient Jewish mystics to navigate the heavens. Now, tajweed, how a word sounds versus the meaning, because in Islam, tajweed is critical. You have to pronounce the words correctly. You have to say things correctly. It's not so much about the meaning. And here's, I wish Saint Murad was here today, because he's spoken about this at length. It's not that they would necessarily mean anything, but they need to be, the Quran is written to be specifically pronounced, recited, rhymed in a very particular way. He says they will often break Arabic grammar specifically to make it rhyme and sound a very particular way. Now, for many, let's go on.
Sorry, yes, before you continue, I know that in Sharia, there are some instructions as to how to recite certain things, just in case that you want to bring it up so that people can see it in Sharia if you have it at hand. I know it says, like, for example, how you say Allahu Akbar, you have to say it in a very specific manner, otherwise the prayer is not going to be accepted, all those sort of things.
It must be very precise. I'm not going to go into that too much now. I've only got a few slides in this. I'm condensing this. But I just want to bring this up because if you read through the Encyclopedia of Islam, right, there is so much emphasis on this, but it is ignored. Scholars don't look at it. Lay people don't look at it. I've been looking at this stuff for a long time and wondering, why the heck is this here? Roughly half of all the references in the encyclopedia at some point link back to Quranic magic or Islamic magic. And I'm like, why? Why aren't we discussing this? Anyway, so for many Gnostics, The physical world was a prison created by a lower deity, the demiurge, often thought of as Yahweh, right, the Christian God, and his assistants, the archons or rulers. And to return to the pleroma, the fullness or the divine realm, the soul has to ascend past the archons, who are gatekeepers. At each gate, an archon would challenge the soul, right? Would challenge the soul. Think of the word challenge. The soul would recite specific formulas or names. Basically, you're like hacking the system by proving they possess the gnosis, the secret knowledge of the true divine origin. In the Gospel of Mary, or the first apocalypse of James, the soul is taught exactly what to say. I am a son from the Father. I derive from the pre-existent one. But understand, it's not just this is a formula you can actually understand. It's using dictionary words, but some formulas didn't use dictionary words, but they had to be pronounced precisely. They had to be rhymed and spoken in the correct way. Now, in Islam, you have the concept of samiyya, right? A name for certain genres of magic, like hypnotism. Think of it as NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. This is basically neuro-linguistic programming and letter magic, right? Mastered in particular by Ahmad al-Buni. I'll bring up your slide. Yes, JC?
Yeah, just to give an example of this, I think probably Murad would bring this one up as well, because look how it reads. So Surah 3, verse 3, and he revealed the Torah and the Gospel. They're putting a full stop there, but it's then before. So in many translations, it will say, and he revealed the Torah and the Gospel from before, or something like this, because they have broken up this sentence right there. It doesn't make any sense. But in order to make it rhyme, they have broken it up in this very, very unusual manner.
Right. Yep. So this is something Murad has spoken of. So now the strings of letters Hegirvin, Sigirvin are strikingly similar to Gnostic papyri found in. Now, by the way, this letter magic, I'll go to that in a moment. Actually, hold on. Let me bring this up while I'm here now. So let me look at letter magic, right? I know. Let's skip that for now. But the whole letter magic is basically the Quran has solar letters, moon letters, or lunar letters. It's got sun, wind, earth, which is your standard sort of elemental ideas. And then also there's the science of Samiyya. It also includes the angelic names and being able to know and pronounce the angelic names correctly, which is part and parcel of what is considered, at least to the highest scholars, part of the Quran, right? So these are very similar. These mystical names, these words, these nonsense words, right, are similar to Gnostic papyri found in Egypt in Naj Hammadi, or the Greek magical papyri. These are not meant to mean something in a dictionary. They are vibrational. The sound was thought to resonate with the frequency of that specific heavenly gate. Allahu, think about that, right? Now, Alif, Lam, Mim, or Hamim, these are mysterious, but the words, supposedly no one knows what they are, but they set a ritual tone. They require a specific elongated tajweed pronunciation, or mud. I'll pause there for a moment. Any thoughts from you guys before I continue?
Yeah, but I don't think you will like it, Lloyd. For me, this is all rubbish. This is
it's real.
I agree that the sound can have the sounds can have an effect on conscience, and this is
and this is going to be very important.
What has been done here. But the thing with the Quran is that the Quran was not written with this purpose in mind. Everything has been developed afterwards, and this proves that this.
Yeah, but remember, I'm not doing the origins of the Quran. Yeah. I'm doing Islam, the influences on Islam. So this is an influence on Islam because there are reams of paper, there are volumes on this particular topic that's very important.
Yeah, I agree. It's an influence within Islam, but the thing is, you can make this kind of effects with any text, actually. And that's the thing with Gnosticism. With Gnosticism,
you Gnostic. It's a parallel, but this is before Gnosticism, even, I think.
So, it's the thing with spiritualism, if you like, or esotericism. You can develop any secret meaning you want to anything So
Yep.
actually, it's not based on history, on rationality, on
No, it's not meant to be
on
rational.
something real.
It's not meant.
You can. But
not meant to
I
be
fully agree that there is something at play here. Many converts to Islam said that they were converted because they heard the Quran being sung, being proclaimed with a specific cantillation, a kind of music, and it had an effect on them.
Yep. No, and that's the whole point. That was the whole point.
Yeah, I think the effect wasn't hard coded within the text. It's something that has been
It's
superimposed.
something the highest scholars know. I mean, this is not what they teach you in like Sunday school. Understand? This is if you become a scholar and you go to Al-Azhar University and you become a Sufi, then they're going to start teaching you this stuff. It goes into the details.
Yeah,
Now,
but there's no magic
What?
within the text. You see, it's something else. It's a different area.
Yeah,
May
there's
I-
the
may I-
Quran and the, go on, JC.
Yeah, I actually am going to say that I think you are both right. I think that the Quran doesn't have any of this. The Quran was picked up at a point when they couldn't even read it. But this was in the traditions. This is something that they were very well aware of. And then they have imposed this in the Quran. That's why now it is read in that manner. But if we had the text
Mhm.
without any vowels, no, it was read very differently. Now it has to be recited, which is adorned letters. They shouldn't do it. According to their traditions, that is supposed to be of the devil, but then that's what they have done with the Quran. So it's certainly in the traditions, and they have pushed that into the Quran. But if we went back to the 7th century and we look at the text, that those things were not there at that point. They were inserted late. That's what I
Yeah.
think.
I don't argue with that. It's just that we're looking at. There's just so much of the stuff in the Islamic literature. So this is all hidden stuff, Gnosticism. So look at the Ilm al-Huruf, okay, the Akhruf, the Ilm al-Huruf, the science of the Akhruf, if you will. Onomatomancy, a magical practice. Now, obviously, scholars say, "Oh, we don't know what the Akhruf are. There's 7 different reading versions and styles, and it's the meaning of words, blah blah." Sure, those things are all true, but there's also the science of the Akhruf, and that is onomatomancy, a magical practice based on the occult properties of the alphabet and of the divine and angelic names which they form. This is a legitimate part of Islam. Okay. Now, a surah like it, Ayat al-Tahadi, okay, the verses of challenge. So this rhythmic rhyming quality is designed to induce a trance-like state. It's the same flow found. Actually, sorry, I'm going to have to fix this slide. Give me a second. You know what? I'm just going to move this slide out of the way. I am going to make a fresh page. I'm just going to drop this in here and we'll continue again. Why not? Because I made a boo-boo. Okay, so this rhyming quality is designed to induce a trance, right? It's the same flow found in Saj or rhymed prose, which was used by pre-Islamic oracles, the Kahins. Now, the word Kahin also comes from the Jewish Kahin, okay, or so basically the Jewish priests. But of course, now we're talking about the Kabbalah and you're talking about Jewish mystics, because this is a very strong parallel to Jewish mysticism, which then becomes Islamic mysticism, but it's also adopted by other cultures, right? And is perfected in the rhythmic endings of Quranic verses. It bypasses the logical brain and hits the spiritual ear. Now, Yemen was
Is it possible just to pause there for a moment, Lloyd? Because you're giving us complex stuff. I need to just slow it down to ensure I'm not losing the thread here. What did you say the Ayat al-Tahadi is?
The verses of challenge, basically. It's the whole challenge, make a surah like it, the verses of challenge.
Okay, right, fine. And where does the rhythmic rhyming quality, how does that connect with the verses of challenge?
We'll get, that's what I'm getting to. I'm still on the way.
It's just you start there saying the rhythmic rhyming quality is designed to, and are those verses particularly rhythmic?
No, it's not specific. It's the method.
Okay.
I'm not referring to any verse in particular. It's the method.
Okay, that's good.
So Dominic Cases says, yeah, this is legitimate influence on a false religion. Yeah, I mean, it's now So Yemen was a hub for these vocal traditions, right? And inscriptions apparently show early use of rhythmic language in ritual texts. And in Islam, there's a thing called balaga, eloquence, but also rhetoric, the science of rhetoric, ilm al-balaga, right? The science of rhetoric. Now, because for them, for the scholars of Islam, how something sounded, how it was heard, was often more important than what it meant, right? So you didn't just read it, you heard it. So from the Jewish piyutim, or liturgical poems, to the early development of Arabic phonetics, the region was obsessed with the power of the spoken word, right? So the Elchasites and other Baptist groups were also known for their rhythmic prayers and chants during their rituals. Like whenever they did their ritual bathing of the day, like their 5 baths a day or whatever, or 5 cleansings a day or whatever it was, they would also have these ritual things they would recite. So it's almost as if this ancient religion wasn't a set of beliefs that you necessarily read in a book. Because think about it, how many converts to Islam have no idea? Usama and any Muslim will tell you, people can recite the Quran, they will memorize it and recite it. They have no idea what it says. What's important is that they can rhyme it and say it. That's how it sounds, not what it means, because they have no idea what it means. So it's not about beliefs you read in a book, but a musical score you perform to tune in to the divine. You get points for being able to recite the Quran, not know what it means. So the Quran verses, the ayat, frequently end with rhythmic closures, internal rhymes, and sonic patterns that create this flow, this rhythmic, harmonious, hypnotic flow. Now, classical commentators, they call this ijaz, inimitability, partly in its linguistic miracle, but the auditory dimension. And we don't think about that from a Western perspective, but the sound was key to its impact on the listeners, which is why recitation is so important to these Arabs, to that culture, right? Especially pre-Islamic, right? And still with the Arabs, but it was there from the pre-Islamic times, poetry and the sound, how it made you feel. So recitation, tajweed, amplifies this, your proper intonation, the elongation of the words, Allah, all of that nonsense, and the pauses turn it into something that feels bodily and emotional, not just intellectual. They would often, the whole approach is orthopraxy, a correct performance over orthodoxy, correct belief. You don't have to know what the hell you're doing. You just have to do the thing you're told to do and do it correctly. So making a surah like it was less about, look, any retarded 5-year-old, right, can write a surah like the Quran. I mean, please, it's the easiest thing in the world, but can you say it correctly? Can you pronounce it? Can you intone it? Can you vocalize it correctly? Can you make a surah like it? Can you make one that is going to have the vocal qualities? I think this is part of what they were alluding to. I'll pause there for a moment. It's a mantra.
May I
yeah, go on.
add a couple of things? First, I saw on the channel of Gabriel Reynolds one conversation with Professor Jack Tanos, who said very clearly about the Quran that there are so many words, for example, that end with an aleph, but now they're actually ending with an nun sound, with an n sound. And he said that is not obvious. People in Islam, they say, no, it's always been like this. People knew how to read it. And he says, no, it's not obvious. There must be a tradition behind it. I think all of those things really point to what I mentioned before, that the Quran was read in one particular manner. Later, they add these things about reciting things and doing all of this word magic. It is imposed in the text. They make it sound nice. I think it serves first the whole tradition of word magic, but also to convince people that the book is divine is part of the whole process. Now, every Muslim believes that oral tradition was really a thing and that people memorize the book even though it was not written down, when it's absolute nonsense. And it is because it rhymes and they can do that, but they can do that now. They couldn't do that in the 7th century. So it's part of brainwashing them into believing that this thing was read in this manner from day one, when it's just not the case. You just look at the text and the features weren't there. And there was no oral tradition to recite the Quran. So I think it's first it starts as a normal text, but they impose all of these recitations in this manner much later. That's my take.
Yeah. Juliet says tajweed is from the word jawada, to make a recitation sound excellent. This concept developed in the 9th century, probably influenced by Syriac Orthodox chanting of hymns. There's a very similarity. You can go to the Aramaic and you can go to, but before that, you'll have the Jewish Kabbalistic scholars that would also indulge in this kind of thing. But yeah, any thoughts before I go on? Because I think that this will end very shortly. I just wanted to introduce this.
Yeah, and it's it seems to me to get some strength from the your thesis from the word Quran, which I think is now fairly commonly held, means recitation. It doesn't mean a book. It means an oral speaking
Recitation
of a text, not a written text. There is a certain strangeness to the fact that the Quran refers to itself, or at least I'll rephrase that. The text that we now call the Quran, and each surah was produced individually, they refer to something, probably itself, as the Quran, the recitation. It's been the point is fairly obvious that the Quran wasn't all released in one go. The Quran actually says it was announced in stages. So when the Quran talks about the Quran, it can't be talking about the Quran that Muslims read today, because the whole thing hadn't been finished then at any individual stage. And it doesn't, and one could get around this by saying, oh, well, the Quran exists. It's been brought down from Gabriel, from the heavens, from God, and the big pen. And it's been brought down to it's resting in the heavens, and then it's now being drip fed down. But then it would be a written text. It wouldn't be a recited text. It would be a kitab. It wouldn't be a Quran. The word Quran does seem to lay particular emphasis upon the idea of recitation rather than either the written word or the meaning of the written word, or the meaning of the recited word. So that's a point that I think would help you. A slight kind of counterpoint, I suppose, would be that the early manuscripts we have, some of them have vowelization from quite an early time, but my understanding is there quickly comes a time when there is no vowelization, where the actual amount of vowel signs you get in the
text. You have to know the oral recitation.
They actually disappear. So there is a point of principle made, particularly in the what do they call the square text, the classic square fonts.
The rasm of
Basra,
the consonantal text.
Yeah.
But then only the initiative.
So they seem to lose that. I'm wondering, is that really? And then, of course, you have all the arguments, and then people bitterly disagreeing with each other about, how to pronounce things. And you think, well, that's the consequence of the people making the decision not to write it down. Wouldn't somebody have written down an authoritative version quite early on if it was so important?
Right. Yeah. But it seems the challenge is not only write better prose than us, but it's closer to produce a piece of sacred sound that does what this does. It entrances, it convinces, it captivates, it feels like it comes from Allah, whatever. It's beautiful, it's perfect when it's performed live. Because I haven't covered this on the channel yet, but I've got some really interesting research on pre-Islamic paganism, like what Muhammad's family would have believed. And they were huge, because they weren't a written culture, apparently. They were huge into poetry and prose. And those who gave the best poetry and the best prose were possessed by the best jinns or demons. It was a massively oral culture, and you had to learn to pronounce and say things the most perfectly.
Yeah, I think at one stage the Quran curses poets, doesn't it? It says God's curses on poets. And that seems a bit harsh for anybody who likes a bit of poetry, particularly since the Quran is itself a poem. Or a select collection of poems. But the interpretation of that, which is quite possible, is that people associated poetry with sorcery and communing with spirit.
Correct. Poetry was very much. And in fact, if the only way to be remembered was through a song or a poem created by one of these master poets, and a master poet could only be so if he was possessed by a powerful jinn. Yeah. Anything before I go on? Because this part's done here, so I'm moving on to the next.
Do you really want me to add my grain of salt here? You know it.
I mean, look. I mean, the thing is, everything I've stated here is taken from Islamic sources. I mean, this is legitimate Islamic practice. All of it. I could go for days on that, but clearly there's an influence.
You uncovered a very, very interesting topic, that the way that the sound can affect the conscience. But I don't think the Quranic challenge is about this. Write better prose than us, produce a piece of... It's not about producing sacred sound. It's about writing something that looks like what Paul defined. The Quran refers to another book. It doesn't refer to itself. It refers to a lectionary that is called Quran within the text. We already did a presentation on this topic. And so I think that when the Quran, when you find there are several verses in the Quran that ask to produce a better surah or bring 10 surahs like this, it's not about mimicking the actual Quran in Arabic. It's about mimicking the external book, the other book, the lectionary.
I'm not saying that's wrong. It's probably perfectly correct, but then scholars have a different interpretation. So there's the one meaning for this group, and there's another meaning for that group, and another meaning for that group. You know, layers of meaning.
I don't agree with them, and I don't think they're right, because
it's a legitimate practice within Islam.
They take the Islamic interpretation for granted. They don't question it. They should question it, because this interpretation that the word Quran within the Quran refers to the Quran is nonsense, like Paul said. The Quran cannot refer to itself as a finished book, for example. And that's something that makes no sense, that would not make sense. The Quran, for example, talks about a Quran that is written in clear Arabic. Actually, the Arabic Quran is not written in clear Arabic. It's written...
No, it's not. Yeah, I'm not sure that... I mean, look, we know the hadiths are nonsense, but the hadiths are relevant as well. They need to be studied. I mean, it's all garbage. We know that all of these things are garbage, but they still are relevant. They're still valid. And I mean, when they added it, that's a question we haven't quite answered. You know,
Lloyd, if I could ask you a question, Lloyd, are you suggesting that there is, or at the time that the Quran was being composed, was it the understanding of the composer or composers, the authors, and possibly some members of their audience, that it actually contained some rhythmic forms of words that would have a metaphysical effect beyond the meaning of the words? Are you suggesting that was actually embedded in the Quran itself, that there might be some alliteration or special use of vocabulary or words like samad? Because springs to mind that no one knows what they mean.
I mean, once the concept of, let's say, the Bible or whatever they were taking, right? They were copying it from whatever sources. Once you fit it into a given culture that has a certain set of practices, I guess it's going to consciously or unconsciously align with the practices already prevalent within that community, within that environment. I mean, there's some that say, for instance, that what's his name? The whole Syro-Aramaic Quran idea is overdone. What's his name by Luxembourg, right? Some would say he's right, but he's perhaps exaggerating the whole issue too much. I mean, what is the Quran? You know, we can speculate, and also, I mean, according to some of the stuff, Odon, we did a talk where we looked at the Quran, and there was the one French scholar who did an analysis of it, right? He ran a whole mathematical analysis. He worked out there's 3 to 50 scholars that, and it was written over something like 200 years. You can see
this is wrong. He put it in his thesis, but this is actually a wrong conclusion. I've discussed it with him. He kind of agrees with me. But
Yeah,
there might have been changes in the Quran very late, but the 200 years period, it's much too long.
it's fair, but I mean that was his view. There was like a long period. I mean, the Sharia took ages to develop. So I know the Quran probably.
The thing that Jean-Jacques Walter proved is that he made two groups of verses within the Quran. The one who have a kul, say, as the first word, and all of the others. And he proved that the two ensembles have different authors. Proceeding from this, he hypothesized that the kul were added by the Caliph Al-Mutawakkil in the 9th century.
Mhm.
And based on this, he said, so it was modified in the 9th century, so there is a 200 years period.
Added to.
But the
Well,
kul, the word say
can I
have
ask?
been
Can I
added
ask you
before.
Just a second.
Can
Just
I
to
ask
add
who
to
said
something.
this?
Oh, Walter. His name is Walter. French scholar called Walter.
Jean-Jacques Walter.
Okay.
Yeah. Think about this. You've got in the 7th century, who was it? The Christian cleric, John of Damascus. He talks about the 4 books, right? He speaks. Now, those 4 books are not exactly part of the literature that we know of. Like, I mean, the camel stories all disappeared, basically, right? Was that the Quran? Because he says there was no Quran. They just had 4 separate books, right? Then you've got people saying, well, it's a Syro-Aramaic lectionary. These are 2 separate, completely separate things. Which one was the Quran, right? So obviously there was no Quran at that point. Probably there were just these books, and eventually they got hold of maybe a lectionary, whatever it was. But then also it's composed of multiple different sources from Zoroastrian, pagan, Gnostic, heterodox Jewish and Christian sources. So what was the original source? What was added on top later? I mean, do we take it at face value? What was added later? How much have they muddied the waters? But that's really my issue. I'm not trying to decipher this. What was the original Quran? I'm looking at what are the pagan influences on Islam, and these are legitimate practices. And I can find sources that predate them.
You cannot ask this question, what was the original Quran, without answering first the question, what is the Quran? And this is the most important question. And in order to answer this question, you have to understand Islam, how Islam emerged and developed, what is the Quran for Islam, what is a prophet, and so on. So it's actually, it's not that simple to answer this question. For example, if you ask the question, what is the original Quran? You take for granted that there was a Quran. That, for example, Muḥammad proclaimed the Quran. But this we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. The Quran doesn't say that Muḥammad proclaimed the Quran. Since the Quran, the Quranic text refers to another book, which is named the Quran.
So you had teachings, and you had a few scattered chapters, and then the Quran seems to come later.
For me, the Quran is a collection of teachings and proclamation that were and prayers and stories and so on, but mostly these were made in order to convert Christian Arabs to Judeo-Nazarenism, to convert them to the project of taking Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. And in order to do so, in order to have this conversion, a lectionary of Judeo-Nazarene text was written, and the proclamation of Muhammad and maybe other preachers aimed at they try to have the Arabs adopting the lectionary. So in the Quran we find presentations about the lectionary. It is written.
Yeah, I actually want to rehash this. That's a totally different topic to what I'm on about. But I'm talking about the whole
this hypothesis. Everything makes sense.
Yeah, fair. Paul, you asked me the question. Did I answer your question, or did you have a thought you wanted to add on top of that?
I'm not sure. But I think my question was, in your opinion, does the author of the Quran, the guy who's to be a bit more precise in the light of Odin's comments, the person who composed the text, or majority of the text, or some of the text that find its way into the modern Quran, did that person try and embed in that text
I don't think so.
particular forms of words that
I don't think so.
that would open
According
doors
to
of heaven?
Saint Murad, the language was butchered to make it sound a certain way. So no.
Okay, so this is all later supposition.
I to agree with
as you would say, garbage. If it comes along later on and it says there's something there that isn't there, then I would classify that as garbage.
Yeah, but also Murad talks of many of the authors or whomever wrote the books of the Quran also weren't first language Arabs. This was obviously they were writing in a different language, which means they butchered the grammar anyway. So then if they were from Persia, which is where Elchasai is from, then they might have added that into their, consciously or subconsciously added it into their rewrites or whatever, the interpretations or edits.
Can I add two remarks?
No. Okay, go ahead.
Just one then. Just
so go on.
Okay,
go on.
No remarks then. Okay.
Go on. No, go on.
Okay. So the first one. It's about a French author, Michel Cuypers,
Cuypers, oh yes, I didn't know.
Yeah, you know him, Paul.
I've got 3 of his books behind me somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
I like his style. He persuades me when I'm reading them. Afterwards, I have doubts about what he's read, but he's very persuasive as he makes his case. I think that's good.
Yeah, but actually,
the Banquet I was very fond of.
Yeah, exactly. It's the Banquet. He wrote a book about the 5th surah, so the Banquet, and he explained that there are passages within this surah that have a sort of orality construction. But he doesn't put it this way because he doesn't know a lot about orality tradition. But there are parallels, concentric constructions, and so on, which seems to reveal that they were very well written, very well thought. So maybe in these passages, the sound dimension has been developed. Maybe, I don't know. So I think everything is not rubbish within the Quran. There are some very well constructed passages. And my second remark was that it might be that the other book, the lectionary that is referred to in the Quran, might have had this sound construction, sound dimension. We don't know.
Aramaic, and very possibly, yes.
And in this case, the interpretation, your interpretation of the verse, bring me 10 surahs like it, would make sense. But it would not be referring, it would not refer to the Quran, but to the other book.
I think there's room for more than one right answer. I think all of these answers could be correct, given their context.
I don't think so. If you think the verses talking about,
this is not really relevant to my topic. Right? I mean, I'm proposing that
hypothesis.
I mean, this is not really relevant to the topic I'm discussing here. In that, tajweed would not be a thing in Islam if it was unimportant, but it's a big thing. And when you go into the Islamic references, the works of the scholars, the Encyclopedia of Islam, it is massive. It is hugely important. Now, maybe today it's not as well known, but it was back in the day, right? It was then. We can say, well, it's unimportant now. We can go, the Middle Ages don't matter. That's all God. Well, I mean, we got here because of that, right? You can throw it away and say it wasn't important, but for some reason it somehow seemed important. Or maybe they downplay it because they don't want us looking at it. But there's some relevance to it, and they wouldn't have it otherwise. I think, JC, you were going to say?
Yeah, so the way that I see it is there is this guy recorded in their traditions as Ibn Thabit, who is the guy who goes and basically puts this thing together. We now call it the Quran. But when he puts the thing together, he's taking certainly from Jewish legends, Christian legends, from all sorts of things, different things. But at that point, if there was something like Allahu Akbar, it would be read Allahu Akbar. That's it. By the time that we get to the Abbasids, and that's when they start creating Islam, which happens much later, it has a different origin than the Quran. Those are the guys that are using these techniques. So looking at these techniques could tell us more about the region and the influences, maybe from Eastern Christian churches where they were reciting things,
Yeah.
maybe from some heresies, perhaps from Kabbalistic views. But the Quran, it was very basic. It was just words. By the time that Islam is being created, this thing is very important. So when we're looking at Islam, we need to look at this. When we're looking at the Quran, well, that's 200 years prior.
Yeah, when are we looking at it? So, yeah, I mean, look, let's hold off on that for now, because it touches on the thing is, I mean, it's all part of Islam, but it gets ignored. You know, I mean, think about it. 5 years ago, Islam consisted of the Quran and the Hadith, right? And I was a freak for talking about the Sharia. Now everyone talks about the Sharia. Suddenly, that's also part of Islam. You know, what's that Lloyd guy talking about? The Sharia. You know, now everyone talks about it. So there's much more. Islam is much deeper. It's much bigger than we realize. And it became relevant, even if it wasn't part of the original Quran. But I'm not doing, how did the Quran start? That's not the topic I'm investigating here at all, right? I'm looking at these outside influences. So Metatron. Now, we started off with the Elchasai and these massive angels, which come out of Jewish literature, right? In the Jewish Apocrypha and the early Kabbalah, Metatron is the name that Enoch received after his transformation into an angel. Enoch is very big in certain traditions, like in the Ethiopian church, as well as, of course, within Islam. He received books from Allah. Again, another thing that just disappeared off the face of the earth, the fact that many of these prophets received books from Allah, right? Metatron is mediated between God and Israel. In Islamic tradition, he's known as Metatrun, the angel of the veil. This is the angel. The veil would be, when you're a mystic, you cross through the veil and you enter into the throne room of Allah. So Metatron is depicted in the Daqa'iq al-Haqa'iq, right, the degrees of truths here in this book with this story. Okay, with that. Now, 7 witnesses are called to confirm the teaching of Elchasai. The 7 witnesses are heaven, water, the Holy Spirits, plural, the angels of prayer, oil, salt, and earth. Now, they are Islamic, in Islamic letter magic, you know, things
Olive
like...
oil. Yeah. Just a remark. Olive oil.
Right, probably. I think so.
Not,
the book was used by...
petroleum.
Go on, please. Sorry.
No, it's olive oil. It's not petroleum.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, they're definitely not petroleum. No, the book was used by a number of Transjordanian sects, including the Ebionites, the Essenes, right? Luhmann highlights the later adoption of the book by Ebionites, right? And then also by the Elchasites, who based their origins on it. According to Epiphanius, Elchasai and his brother Jeksai had joined the Osaeans, probably identical with the Essenes. So Essenes, who as well as the related sect of the Nazarites received his authority. They lived in the region beyond the Jordan, offered no sacrifices, and condemned the use of meat. The book is characterized by Epiphanius as containing the doctrine of persons who are neither Jews nor Christians, nor pagans, but they hold a middle position between these, which is really interesting. And the creed of the Elchasites contains such a mixture of Jewish, Christian, and pagan elements that a classification of the sect is extremely difficult. This is from Epiphanius. There's such a mixture of all of this garbage, you have no idea what's going on. That is Islam today. But he says they must be regarded as Jewish because they insisted on the rule of the law, which is something that the Sharia, and they held that the faithful must be circumcised and live according to the Sharia. Hippolytus heresies. Special emphasis was laid on the observance of the Sabbath. These are the Friday people, fine and well, and the turning of the face towards Jerusalem during prayer, but they weren't Jews. They were Jewish in character, but not in substance. So this would very well, I think this aligns with Islamic practice. Any thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, you know, the verse 159 in Surah 7, among the people of Moses is a community which guides by the truth and by it establishes justice. There was a something Jewish-like at the origins of Islam, and I think you're pointing at it here.
I agree. No, I agree with you on that thesis. I've told you, I agree with you fully there. There's this definitely that strong influence. But now we've got ancient evidence that speaks of this syncretic mixing of these different strands that are not necessarily compatible. But this, I mean, this matches everything else. JC, your thoughts?
Well, yes, zeroing in on that description. So this group that has all of this stuff from Jews, from Christians, and from pagans, if we ignore everything else that we have discussed and we looked at that, that is really, like you said, describing Islam. So when people get upset when they say, no, Islam was like a Christian heresy or a Jewish heresy, it's like, it's sort of that. It's sort of like a mixture. If Hippolytus was around today and looked at Islam, this is what he would be saying to describe Islam. So yeah, it looks like the same influences, the same thought process that was with these groups was transferred or copied into Islam. Very similar.
Yeah, and it matches all the whole monotheism thing I've been doing as well.
Yeah.
It matches that. Paul, you any thoughts?
There are other sources who talks about these groups. You talk about Epiphanius, Hippolytus. Augustine of Hippo spoke about them also in a letter to Jerome of Sweden, Saint Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin.
Right, yeah.
He wrote him, there still exists among the Jews in all the synagogues of the East a heresy which is called that of the Maniaeans. Actually, it means minim. It means heretics in Hebrew.
Yep, I've spoken about
which
that.
is
Yes.
still condemned by the Pharisees. Its followers are ordinarily called Nazarenes. They believe that Christ, the Son of God, was born of the Virgin Mary, and they hold him to be the one who suffered under Pontius Pilate and ascended to heaven, and in whom we also believe. And this is the important part. But while they pretend to be both Jews and Christians, they are neither.
Fascinating. So, yeah, I mean, look, do you think I'm onto something here? There's so many parallels here.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say they've laid a lot of red herrings for us. They've tried to cloud their tracks, cover their tracks as well, to make it hard to figure out what happened. Paul, any thoughts from you while you're sitting there?
And also the Islamic tradition tried to erase this memory.
Right.
For example, the Quran talks about the Nazarenes, Nasara, but the tradition invented the meaning of Christian for this word. So you see, they were completely erased from history. Even their name has been erased.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sort of damnatio memoriae, like in ancient Rome, when someone had the ultimate condemnation. His name was to be erased from every book, every record. His statues were destroyed. Should one name have been written on a wall or as an epigraphy, it would be erased. So nothing would remain of it.
Right. Yeah. Paul, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, just a couple. My understanding of Metatron, just going back to old Metatron, my understanding of his name is that it means beside the throne. Meta means beside, doesn't it? Or after. And I understood that Tron meant throne in Greek. Is that not correct? I thought you had a different.
I can't remember, to be honest.
etymology.
It kind of makes sense because to me, because he is enthroned, and in the story of the Book of Enoch, he's raised up to heaven and he's put on a throne, and he's treated as I think a little Yahweh, almost like a second God or a prophet with godlike characteristics. So it's the name Metatron might make sense to me, but I hadn't heard any alternative.
Okay.
The other point I was just going to make is that Metatron is Enoch, and Enoch is supposedly referred to in the Quran, isn't he? Twice is referred to in Surah Maryam, and also
he's also Idris. Enoch is Idris.
Yes.
Who is Thoth, he's the second prophet in Islam, but he's also Thoth, the Egyptian moon god, who is also Hermes, Trismegistus. There's also Hermes. So he's got three incarnations. So it's really
in Surah Maryam, does he not say they name him, and the Quran also says, and we raise the divine voice, and we raise him to a sublime station, or a high station, which is on the face of the text, that doesn't go any further really than the Book of Genesis. When the Book of Genesis implies that he walked with God and then was seen no more upon the earth, that would tend to imply that God had taken him up to heaven. But the fact that is mentioned in the Quran seems to me significant and tends to suggest some sort of endorsement of the Enochic literature. So I don't think the Quran necessarily hides from the Enoch Metatron story. Also, of course, it tells the story of the Queen of Sheba walking on the crystal floor, which is I'm sure you are familiar as part of the Enochic tests, isn't it?
It's taken from the Jewish secondary, from the Midrash as well, and from the other sources. Yeah. So, Islam borrows a lot of these things. So you're talking about this group. Yeah, go on.
May I, before we move on, because in here as well, when it says about the observance of the Sabbath, so obviously in the Quran, it curses the Jews who disobeyed the Sabbath. Then in their traditions, and even John of Damascus says that these people are prohibited from observing the Sabbath. But we see Islam today, and their Saturday is basically, their weekend begins on the Friday and Saturday, and they go to pray on Friday, which is like the Sabbath. Do you know if there is a connection there where maybe they were observing the Sabbath, but then they said, no, it's not Sabbath. We're still doing it at the same time, and we're going to pray and all of those things, but it has nothing to do with the Jews? Or do you think it has another origin story for that practice?
I don't know. I mean, no idea. Just something to observe, and we'll get to it. Sexual desire for these people was presented as wickedness, but a sin that could be cured through baptism. Now, don't forget, baptism became ablution effectively for these people. They would have daily baptisms, ablutions, really. So a ritual ablution, a ghusl, is part of Islamic practice after sexual intercourse, right? That's the traditional view. So the book also uses numbers and measures to foretell the future, that advocates healing rituals as well as a schedule based on astrology. And 40 days of baptism would cure possession. And the book is apocalyptic, speaking about an impending crisis, right? So we know that the book of Elchasai and Islam, and the way Muhammad starts out, that was highly apocalyptic. So reincarnation in the Quran. Now, the universe is said to be governed by principles created by Allah, who is called the Great and the Most High God, right? Allah's Son Christ, also called the Mighty King. God, in this case. Along with the Holy Spirit, this is the book of Elchasai, my bad. Right? God's Son Christ, also called the Mighty King, along with the Holy Spirit, who is female, are depicted as angels of enormous size in the book of Elchasai. Christ is said to have lived on earth repeatedly through reincarnation. Sometimes he arrived through virgin births. However, Jesus is taught to have been conceived naturally, right? Pythagoras is the most famous proponent of reincarnation among the ancient Greeks, and Plato took the idea forward and embedded it into his famous book, The Republic. I mention Al-Farabi here because Al-Farabi basically took the idea of the republic, of how to run a nation state, right, the perfect nation state, and he expanded upon that, and that basically became the template for creating the caliphate. But he expanded it to the entire world effectively, right? Also, many people thought they were taking Plato's works, but it was actually sort of pseudo-Plato, some guy who knew Plato, who was copying Plato, and when they're teaching this as Plato's works, turned out to not be Plato, but they discovered that centuries later. So the Greeks had several terms that referred to reincarnation. Metempsychosis pointed to the idea of transmigration of the soul after death. So the Quran borrows the idea of reincarnation, it seems, and they say, Quran 32:10, when we are vanished in the earth, shall we then be raised in a new creation? So there seems to be a hint of reincarnation. And in 35:15 and 16 in the Quran, if he will, he can put you away and bring a new creation. And this is generally regarded as references to rebirth, reincarnation.
I'm not sure, in fairness, I'm not sure I can, surely when it says raised in a new creation or being in a new creation, he's not talking about recreating that person, but isn't he not describing the new heaven and the new earth, and from my point of view, the new Jerusalem, which is where we were all.
Yeah, but you'd still be reborn, right?
Well,
so
one can say that. No, I don't think. Will we be reborn? I'm not sure. I think the Ezekiel would say just the bones will be resurrected and re-clothed with flesh. I'm not sure that quite counts as a new birth. It's you could look at it that way, but I'm not sure. I can see in these two verses an endorsement of the doctrine of reincarnation. It seems to me that's just talking about the resurrection. On the last day.
I didn't dwell on this. This is only the slide I've got here. Maybe I'll touch on it later. But there's room for ambiguity, let's just say. There's room for ambiguity. Because at one point they could have meant A and then they meant B. So who knows? It could well also mean both. Right. So I'll move on from here. Now the Mani, the Manichaeans, and Elchasai. This is from Elchasai and Mani. From this paper, by A.F.J. Klein and G.J. Reinink. And they speak here of the Fihrist by An-Nadim at the end of the 10th century, right? So Elchasai is mentioned in the Mani Codex concerning the origin of his body, a 4th to 5th century parchment on Mani's life in a Baptist sect, thought to be derived from the Pauline formulation that the church is the body of Christ. So that's odd, the whole idea of the whole fascination with the body here, right, and the measurements of the body, the mass of angels and so on, the Shur Kamal, thought to be derived from the Pauline formulation that the church is the body of Christ. And this is discovered in Egypt, of course. It speaks of Mani's life in an eventual break with the monastic community of Jewish Christian Baptists in southern Babylonia, in which his father, Patikios, lived, and they refer to the Elchasaios as their former leader or their founder. So scholars have now convincing evidence of the connection of Mani's Baptists with Elchasai. He joined them at 4 years old by his father, who was a convert to the Mu'tazila, the practices of ablution. And we spoke of the Mu'tazila previously, those who wash themselves, self-ablutionists, or the Cathars, right? They practiced daily ablutions. And the Catharoi, the Greek for the pure, here very well may refer to the Cathars, to the Catharism that broke out obviously in Europe much later. The ideas persisted, and of course, so the heresies persisted. This heresy went on from the late 1st, early 2nd century all the way through into the 4th, 5th century and further. So the book refers to the Elchasaios, or the Baptists, right, and finds important points of agreement between the information of the Mani Codex relating to the ideas and practices of the Babylonian Baptists and patristic reports. That's the church fathers writing about the Elchasites. Now, the name Cathar is widely claimed to derive from the Greek word katharoi, meaning the pure. In the 3rd century, the father of Mani belonged to a Judeo-Christian sect known as the Catharioi. Now, it's interesting. So you've got different sources using different names, and they're saying, no, these were the Cathars. The Cathars were basically precursors to the Manichaeans, and the Manichaeans were part of the Elchasai, right? So his father was part of the Catharioi, the Cathars. That's Stoyanov, the other god. Mani formed a Gnostic sect, the Manichaeans, which preserved essential aspects of the Elchasai religion, some of which then developed into Bogomilism and Catharism. Bug, the word Bug is B-O-G, Bug is in the Slavic languages, that would be God. Okay, Bug is God. So that's where the term Bogomilism comes from. The name Cathari has also been used by the Novatian sects of Anatolia in the 4th century, right? Spoken of by Epiphanius in Adversus Heresies. Mani's ideas about the repeated appearances of the Apostle of Light are reminiscent of these Christological ideas. Any comments before I go on?
Yeah, you might remember, I think I've already told it, that Muhammad baptized Umar when Umar converted to Islam, according to the tradition. He put some water on his head when Umar said the Shahada.
So that's just a loose end. How do you explain that?
You cannot explain it within the frame of Islam, within an Islamic frame.
So in the Fihrist from 970, roughly the 980s, okay, the Mu'tazila lived in southern Mesopotamia, used Manichaean sources, using Manichaean sources for his work. And the Mu'tazila are Baptists, those who wash themselves, presumably identical with the Baptists of the Cologne Mani Codex and the pure ones, right? Mentioned in Theodore Bolkonai's synopsis of the early life of Mani. So in An-Nadim, the Mu'tazila were founded by a leader named Elchasai, presumably same sectarian Jewish Christian prophet mentioned by Hippolytus, Origen, Epiphanius, and the founder of the Baptist community among whom Mani was raised. The Mu'tazila were Gnostic, a baptizing sect, often associated with the Mandaeans. The Mandaeans today are said to be the remnants of this group, right? The Mu'tazila argued that the Quran is created, it is not eternal, because they believed that an uncreated Quran would violate the oneness, the Tawhid of Allah, and imply two eternal beings. Now notice though, the Quran, there was a huge fight. And eventually, of course, the Muslims decided to get rid of the Mu'tazila because of this rational disagreement, shall we say. But it means that the two sets of opposing ideas, that stream of thought had continued and persisted, and the two streams were in opposition. In fact, they were in agreement as well, but also in opposition. And they got rid of them, and eventually they couldn't win the argument, so they got rid of them. But it means that there were touch points between them where there was clearly then influence between them. They were part of a given community, and the one of them eventually asserted their own interpretation, got rid of the rest. Any thoughts before I go on?
Go on.
Well, there's an obvious similarity between Mu'tazila and the Mutazila. So one instinctively, if you see two names like that, you'd instinctively think, well, they must be connected. And if the former, the Mu'tazila, were founded by Elchasai, then that seemed like a reasonable link to say that the Mutazila were also Elchasites. But that
we covered that last week. I went through that in the previous notes with the relationship between these. Yeah, go on.
And so, but that would, if that were the case, and you make a reasonable case on that. But if that was the case, then the traditional understanding of the Mutazila must be completely wrong then, because they, and fair enough, they may well be completely wrong, but the Mutazila's role in the what you might call the history of early Islam is not that they're Elchasites at all, is it? They're all
no, you always hear about them in
signed up Muslims.
No, they weren't. But you always hear about them in terms of an argument, because there were major philosophical opponents, especially over the Quran being created or uncreated, right? So they prioritized human reason. Take the word reason with a pinch of salt here, subjective opinion, more like it, over literal interpretations of scripture, especially hadiths. So they rejected many traditional reports that to them seemed irrational. They argued that humans create their own actions through free will, meaning Allah cannot be responsible for human evil. And orthodoxy says that Allah is the creator of all actions, both good and evil. Right, so the Elchasites, the Ebionites, St. Paul. So for Elchasai, prayer was to be made not to the east, but towards Jerusalem. Muslims originally prayed to Jerusalem. So St. Paul is accused by Muslims of changing the Christian Qibla to the east, by the way. Right, so Muslims dislike St. Paul for a number of reasons. I've got a whole series called Polemics, which is all of the writings from the late 7th, 8th century onwards about Muslims, historians about St. Paul, and it's hysterically funny, actually. But they really don't like the guy. And so Paul, apparently there was a Christian Qibla, and we all prayed to the east. So that could be interesting. What are they referring to? Is this like some sort of Eastern Orthodox sect that they were in contact with, or some kind of also Orthodox group that had their own traditions? One has to wonder. Ebionites were influenced by Elchasai. They rejected the conception of vicarious atonement in Pauline Christianity, that Jesus took the place of mankind, suffering the penalty for sin. Islam has a very similar view as well. Atonement means reconciliation or reparations for a wrong, or to make amends, to make things right. Vicarious means done in the place of or instead of someone else. They don't believe Jesus could die for your sins. In literal terms, the Christian concept of vicarious atonement is that Jesus was substituted for humanity and punished for our faults in order to pay our sins. But there are strong Islamic parallels here with these groups in terms of where that idea came from. Any thought before I move on?
It's a very interesting point. You see, all these groups, they all pretend to better know Jesus than Christians. This is their common trait. And here, their rejection of the vicarious atonement, it can be understood as the rejection of Christian salvation, because they make their own salvation. You see, this is why they refuse vicarious atonement. They want to be the makers of their own salvation. They are the saviors, actually, and it's the same within Islam. Muslims save the world, and they are their own saviors. Of course, they do need God, but in the end, Islamization doesn't require the help of God. And so you see, you have to reject Christianity, at least parts of it, in order to pretend to be the savior instead of Jesus.
Right. The Quran's descriptions on who gets to Jannah and who ends up in Jahannam is very confused, whether it's faith or whether it's works. But there are passages where it talks about weighing up. You weigh up a person's deeds as though it's a very meticulous scientific exercise, and there's no scope there for even for God's mercy. The suggestion is that there's going to be a strict, pass or fail assessment exercise. There's some objective factor. So yes, the rule. I'm sorry.
This is also a rejection of Christianity.
It's a rejection of Judaism as well, because Judaism, one could still appeals to God's mercy. It's this idea that you're measuring, you put all your good deeds in one
book
scale, and all your sins in the other scale, and the idea that you measure them up to the nearest exactitude. Yes, it's completely goes against any kind of grace or even God's discretion. I mean, obviously, a Muslim would say God has discretion to overrule it, but the primary basis is, if it's a fair God, you'd say he'd set up a system and he'd administer it fairly, wouldn't he? So
no, God's a Calvinist apparently. So yeah, because that's another long story. But notice the Quran abrogates itself, right? Which you can think of that as an internal conflict. right? Allah's arguing with himself about things. Allah disagrees, right? But now you've got these different streams of philosophical thought, different streams on free will and forgiveness and various other, and also arguments with the Jews, arguments with the Christians, and arguments within Islamic scholars, like the Mu'tazila over the Quran being created or uncreated and all of that. I mean, you've got this fight inside the Quran itself on abrogation, which had to be dealt with in a doctrine. But here you've got so many examples of different groups that were somehow joined, but they were syncretic, so they were incompatible, and they were arguing too on similar issues. So eventually, one of them had to win out, and they won out by force. They had to. I mean, so you have all these incompatibilities trying to get along, and eventually someone says, you know what, we have to forge an identity, separate ourselves, and get rid of the rest. I mean, so you've got the Quran fighting with itself, and then you've got these groups fighting with each other over the meaning of things that are relevant to the Quran, and they all are cultures that have an impact on the region and on the philosophy that's in the Quran. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, JC, any thoughts?
Having too many cooks.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it looks like the Mutasalites were abrogated, once the other guys took over. Funnily enough, one of my regular viewers, he is a Mutasalite, so I'm trying to actually organize a conversation with him to tell me how he can actually retain that view, because basically he says he's a Muslim but believes the Quran the Quran to be created and so on, which is very unusual, and that should have ended in the 9th century, but here we are.
Yeah, and if you think about it, that whole argument about the createdness or uncreatedness of the Quran was a huge thing until eventually it got solved by, was it not Al-Ghazali, by
Al-Mutawakkil.
I thought it was not Ahmad ibn Hanbal, but yeah, but anyway, it got resolved much later. It wasn't resolved immediately.
Oh, there was a political resolution from Caliph Al-Mutawakkil around 840. He imposed the uncreatedness of the Quran, but from a political stance.
Yep.
And you're telling that thereafter there were theologians who justified it.
Right. So the cart came before the horse then. Right. So yeah, I mean, you've got the civil war inside the Quran, and you've got the civil war between these groups that are trying to define things, and they all seem to be related. They're talking to each other. There seems to be a connection between them until one of them eventually decides, okay, you know what, off with your heads. So, okay, so let's
the great problem that has bedeviled Islam right from the very beginning, well, from almost the beginning, is that nobody knows what the Quran really meant. So they've got the text, and the text purports in large part to be the words of God. So if you want to believe that, or you actually believe it, or it's convenient to believe it, then it can't be ignored. These are the very words of God. But they are so difficult to interpret if you don't know what the context or what the true meaning was. There's poetry in there. There's lots of allusions to alternative sources, and if you don't know what those are, and you just say, "Oh, this was just God talking to Muhammad out in the middle of the desert," then no wonder everyone's got different opinions and they're all getting angry with each other. This is an absolute recipe for chaos.
Right. Yeah. I'll finish on this slide. If you guys have anything to add, but I think I'll finish on this slide. I'll leave it here for now. I'm not sure what's after this. So the Elchasites, the Ebionites, Islam. So we come down to these groups, right? Now, arguments have been made that the Ebionites were more faithful to the authentic teachings of Jesus. Obviously, we're dealing with heresies and such here, right? That the Ebionites were more faithful to the authentic teachings of Jesus. Obviously, these people want to put themselves forward as the true Christians, right? And constitute the mainstream of the Jerusalem church before they were marginalized by the followers of Paul of Tarsus. See, St. Paul kicked them to the curb, and they really don't like St. Paul for kicking them to the curb because they weren't true followers of Jesus. You see, they say that he imposed himself because they were the true followers. So that might give us a clue here. Okay. Ebionites insisted on the universal necessity of following Jewish religious law. And if you look at the Sharia, effectively it's a continuation of Jewish religious law. That's very primitive, barbaric interpretation, but there you go, right? So they're following the law. They keep saying to Christians, you don't have a law, while accusing us of not following the law that we have, whatever, right? And they interpreted in the light of Jesus's expounding of the law, because he brought a Sharia, right? Jesus didn't bring a secular law, he brought moral law, right? Jesus was a mortal human, messianic prophet, not divine. Sound familiar?
Mhm.
They revered his brother James as the head of the Jerusalem church, and they rejected Paul of Tarsus as an apostate of the law. Now, Epiphanius relates that some Ebionites alleged that Paul was a Greek who converted to Judaism in order to marry the daughter of a high priest of Israel, but apostatized when she rejected him. Now, Muslims will claim that Paul was a Jew who killed himself to destroy Christianity. They claim that Paul was a Christian who went to the Romans and asked the Romans to kill the Jews. They claim that Paul befriended the multiple different men, and he got these men, he taught them different things, and he got them to found various different churches, the Jacobites, the Nestorians, and the Melkites, which are all sects that started 300, 400, 500 years after Paul died. So, Muslims have a million different stories about St. Paul, right? Which relates very similar to the kind of things that people are saying here, these Ebionites are saying about Paul, right? And this is by Epiphanius of Salamis in the Panarion, right? Chapter 16, verse 9, right? And according to Epiphanius, the Elchasites had a very strong Jewish messianic leaning. As to classifications of the Elchasites as a Jewish, Judeo-Christian, or Gnostic movement, Epiphanius dismissed them by saying, they're neither Christians nor Jews nor Greeks, keeping to the middle way. They are actually nothing.
Yeah.
Your thoughts, guys?
Yeah, it looks very much like the quotation from Augustine that I read a while ago.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Well, they pretend to be both Christian and Jew. They are neither.
It's also got a hint, ironically, of St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, isn't it? Where it says there are no Greeks and no Romans. So
true.
Yes.
Good point. Yeah. So there are these other parallels.
Something else here. It's the reverence to James. So I think it's James the Lesser. So supposedly the brother or cousin of Jesus, he was nicknamed James the Just because he was a very law-abiding, Torah-abiding man, but he was also from the family of Joseph, the father of Jesus, and so he was himself also a descendant of David. So he could have been a Messiah himself. You see, this is one of the reasons why he was so revered by these Elchasites, Ebionites, Nazarenes, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
He was from the blood of David. But the thing is, if you look at the Acts, the book of Acts, he was with Paul and Peter. There was no dissension between them. There is this episode of the Council of Jerusalem, where they seem to have different views, but in the end, they all reconcile. So this idea that Paul sort of changed the church or brought forth dissension, it's all made up. It doesn't fit with the book of Acts.
Yeah. But you've got these groups that are affiliated, linked to, or derived from, or maybe just a different name for the same group, right? Even though they might have some of their, because they're so subjective, they can have some of their own differences and form their own sects. I mean, that's what happens. Look from the Reformation, you've now got 50 billion Protestant sects, right? So the Ebionites, they are authors, they are researchers who say, and historians, whatever, that the Ebionites were Elchasites of a stripe, right? Whatever. And they all hate Paul. right? And they have all these things, and they say Jesus was a mortal human, a messianic prophet, but not divine, etc. You get all these parallels with Islamic beliefs, right? And these people are drawing upon pagan, Jewish, and Christian strands. When I say Jewish and Christians, heterodox, right? Heretical strands. So you've got this kind of mishmash of soup, but it all seems to be in roughly the right place at the right time, with the right links to these whole Islamic ideas.
Yeah. May I say something? I think I'm going to mess it up. But okay, so we have all of these different heresies that in order to gain followers, they have to throw someone under the bus. Very often is Paul, and they say, well, Paul this and Jesus was that. So they will do those things. By the time that we get to Islam, they point at all of those groups and they say, well, you see, the Christians didn't know, and actually we have the truth. They're doing exactly what everybody else did, but instead of saying what happened, what they seem to be doing is they take every single possible story out there from every single heresy plus their own. It's like they combined all of them. Like when we look at what happened on the cross, and instead of saying it was Tatianos on the cross or it was a hologram, they have, well, it could be this, it could be this. It's almost like they take from all of the heresies that they have ever heard of and say, okay, well, you see, this means that Christianity has to be false and Paul is to blame. When they're just putting everything together, they don't even come up with their own heresy. What a lack of respect.
Yeah. I'll finish this page just as food for thought, and then we can close and you guys can give your final thoughts. So the Manichaeans, right? Now, the Docetic interpretation of Jesus' crucifixion was spread by the Manichaeans, right? That Jesus Christ wasn't him on the cross. Someone else died, or it was the spirit on the cross, right? That sort of class of interpretation. Now, Manichaeism was very prevalent in Arabia during the 6th century. It was highly prevalent. And just like the prohibition of wine and the fasting rules, Islamic views on Jesus' death may well have been influenced by Manichaeism, right? And the last point I'll make is that Manichaeism quotes the Gospel of Thomas 73 times. The Gospel of Thomas is not a canonical book, right? It's a Gnostic text. And the Quran quotes the infancy Gospel of Thomas as well and claims it is gospel, like where Jesus has these clay birds and raises these birds from clay. So Manichaeism quotes the Gospel of Thomas 73 times as the word of God, as does the Quran. I'll leave it at that. I'll pause here. Next week we'll pick it up and we'll go into some of the other stuff here. But you guys' thoughts on that? I'll pause here.
There is something. It's even more chaotic than what you present with the Manichaeans. You see you just said that their views on Jesus' death might have influenced the Islamic views on Jesus' death, but actually, if you look at the Quran doesn't say that Jesus did not die on the cross.
No, it says, you're right. I agree with you 100%.
So
yeah, so that's later interpretation.
Yeah.
Later interpretation contradicts the Quran, so that little civil war.
We have evidence here for at least two influences. One that says that he dies on the cross, another that says that he didn't. So at least two cooks spoiling the soup.
It's also true to say, I think, that the Quran doesn't buy into the idea that Jesus was an ordinary human. It came from the Quran is fairly specific, some part of it, that he was created when the angel Gabriel or somebody, the angel of the Lord, blew God's spirit into Mary's womb.
He's the word of God.
So
he's born of a virgin.
Yeah. So it says he shouldn't be called the Son of God, but he wasn't an ordinary person. He was something far.
He
far
does
more
miracles.
detached
He's taken up to him.
Many normal process of birth and conception.
Yeah. So then you have the later Islamic interpretation or reinterpretation to deny what's written in the Quran. remember I spoke of that little civil war, that the abrogations, the contradictions. So you have the later and the earlier, right? And then you've got the first, what's written in the book and what's believed today. And here you've got these two groups that are fighting, and these two groups, who we regard today as the Muslims, were fighting with these guys over how to interpret the facts. And it seems to play out. I mean, just these, I don't know how to phrase it really well, but there just seems to be so many overlaps.
So let me see if I can, if I try. So yes, the Quran says, for example, in Surah 9:31 that Jesus is Lord. Then it says there are lots of references to the Trinity, and it says that Jesus died in Surah 355 and Surah 517. So if the book was put together, and then it happened to have been in a region where the caliphs or the rulers happened to have been Christians, maybe they would still have this Quran as their heresy, but they would say, oh no, we believe in Jesus, we believe in baptism, we believe that he died and resurrected, and they would have come up with other interpretations. But it looks like this book was then used by people who have a belief, and they borrowed these beliefs from other groups, perhaps like Manichaeism, by going, okay, so this is actually what happened. I mean, the book tells a different story, but the group that canonizes the religion, they are getting their beliefs from other places, and then they're just putting that into the text through tafsirs. So the story of Islam would have been very different if the particular caliph who got this book, perhaps during the Abbasids, if he had been a bit more of a Christian or a bit more of a Jew, as opposed to maybe being more of a follower of one of these groups, maybe being in love of the book of Elchasai or something.
I mean, there were groups influenced by the book of Elchasai at the very least that were in contact with Muslims, and these ideas seem to have bled through. And then whatever the Quran says, they often contradict it based on what's in this book. Yeah, I know it's a lot.
Yes.
I mean, it's a whole new sort of thesis I'm throwing at that's evidence, and I'm saying, look, I mean, there's all these things. How do we interpret this?
Yeah, certainly. I think no one will deny, except Muslims, that the Quran tells a very different story to Islam. Islam tells one thing, the Quran says something completely different. So the people who put the traditions on top, and of course to be acted out, they are not the same people who wrote the book. They don't have the same beliefs because the book tells something else. So by doing what you are doing, Lloyd, which is let's go and look at what was happening on the ground, we can see the beliefs of those people who then pushed their beliefs into the book. And yeah, that's very cool.
So there was a war. Someone had written a book that was very Christian Jewish, and then someone took all these weird ideas and smashed them on top. Hold on,
Yeah.
Paul, last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my perception is that's essentially correct. That the Quran is absolutely saturated with both Jewish and Christian references, not just from the Bible, but from the Talmud and these Halakha, and from Jacob of Saru and all this. So the author was, and I heard people call him the Magpie Muhammad, as he's going around picking all these stories from all over the place. I think that's a bit dismissive. I think he was extraordinarily, or whoever put it together, whether it's one person or several people, were extraordinarily widely read. And they, for those times when we didn't have the internet, but libraries and books must have been quite few on the ground, and yet he seems to be had an extraordinarily, or they seem to have an extraordinarily wide range of information sources. So it's totally possible that there were other ideas going on there as well. Not everybody in the ancient world, you're absolutely right, Lloyd, would have been a Christian or a Jew. There would have been other groups around, and there would have been individuals around who put two and two together and came up with some unusual number that's not standard. And I recall something just came into my mind in Crossroads to Islam by Yehuda Nevo, and he finds some inscriptions that post date the Arab conquest of Jerusalem. And these are inscriptions. You find not one or two. You find quite a bundle of them, and they're dedicated to the Lord of Moses and Jesus. And he points out these can't have been written by your average Jew, because the average Jew wouldn't have put Jesus in there. And they couldn't have been written by Christians, because Christians wouldn't put Moses and Jesus on the same level. And they couldn't have been written by Muslims, because they don't mention Muhammad. And so there must have been other people out there who were just doing their own thing. It would have been a soup of different ideas floating around, and people taking what they wanted. And yeah, perfectly feasible that Elchasite ideas or Manichaeic ideas could easily filter in with that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
With I would say a dominant Judeo-Christian flavor.
For sure.
Yeah, maybe the odd crouton floating around in there.
Yeah,
Judeo-Christian croutons, if you please.
the Elchasite croissant.
yeah. I mean, given all of this, right? I know I'm trying to go into some very obscure areas, but can you just casually dismiss all this? Or do you think there's something here that bears investigation, bears further thought, and analysis?
Well, the question is, in a soup, how do you try and
Separate the
put
ingredients.
the bits together? How do you reconstruct the carrot and the potato? And you can't. I don't say you can't, but it'll take an awful lot of work and probably quite a lot of luck to actually find a strand and run that strand right the way back and say this person got their idea from this particular source. Whereas so many of the sources, even between Christianity and Judaism, are shared, and no one quite knows, always which a particular work comes from. You find works that might be Jewish or might be Christian, because it's so difficult to tell.
Yeah. Someone's asking for your guys' social media. Of course, JC is Quranic Endgame. He's actually in the description. I see Odon I didn't put in there, but The Great Secret of Islam. So if you want to find Odon's channel, go to The Great Secret of Islam. It's in his name. You see it right there. I'll just, you can see Odon LaFontaine, The Great Secret of Islam, right? So find him there. And of course, JC is Quranic Endgame, right? So look for Quranic Endgame. And Paul, you don't have a website, right? But you've got a book coming out in the near future.
Yeah, I'm not very active on social media, but I will do. When I've absolutely finished the book, then I'll have to start promoting it like crazy. So I'm keeping my powder dry. I do have a Twitter account.
I've got a publisher I can have you talk to. I've got a publisher in the UK I can have you talk to.
Oh, that would be great.
I've got a good guy.
Oh, you have an academia.edu page.
Yes, I was going to mention that. Some years ago, I put up an article which I say summarizes my ideas, but it's quite long. It's 100 pages long of A4, and that's more than enough for most people. And my thinking has developed quite a lot in the 6 or 7 years since I put it up, but it's still there until I take it down. So if anyone is interested in my general approach, the general approach is still sound. It's called Jerusalem, City of Islam, and if you look for it on academia, you will find it.
Yeah, so Odon is the Poirot for Islam. Hercule Poirot.
Yeah, I think Hercule Poirot was from Belgium, but I won't mind.
In some ways, Odin, you have a little bit
with the Belgian. But Sandro is Portuguese, so okay, so cut him some slack. He can't help it.
In some ways, Odin, you have a little bit of the Sherlock Holmes about you.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think Islam would count as a 3-pipe problem, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's it from me. In terms of today, I think we've covered enough. I mean, I tend to throw a lot of stuff at the wall, but I also try to tie them together. Right? It's just these recurring themes, and they geographically and on the timeline they seem to match. At least, and the ideas persist. And it's always kind of trying to parasitize, shall we say, the biblical narrative, but also trying to nullify and usurp. There's always this constant sort of theme. So
Yeah. I reckon
it's been very interesting.
I reckon that I don't know if we will ever get to the bottom of everything, but I think there is a very good chance that after, because we're showing so many problems with Islam, once Islam has ended, there will be more discoveries. We're always finding, cities buried in the sand and things like that. I think at one point it's likely that we will get some records that will tell us pretty much what happened, maybe the original works of even Ishaq or something of the sort. But for as long as Islam is around, if something is discovered, it's going to be censored or destroyed. But if Islam goes and we find a new city, maybe we get final answers. Otherwise, it will just be a speculation, and we will find the answers in the next life. But hopefully we find it in this one.
Yeah, but I think hopefully I'm showing there are lots of parallels to existing heresies, long-standing heresies that were prevalent at the time in the geographical region. And the connections can't be coincidence. They can't have this many coincidences.
Agreed.
Yeah. So guys, thank you very much, everyone. Much appreciated. So we'll do this again next week if you guys are okay with that. I probably don't have that many slides left. How many slides do I have to go? Like 20 more slides. So, one more episode, and so yeah, I can probably do. In fact, yeah, less. I've got fewer than that. I've got fewer slides than that. So yeah, guys, thank you very much. Really been fun, and yeah, we'll see you all then next week. Take care, guys. God bless.
Bye.
Bye-bye.